these world leaders love it because they just spent the last 2 years terrorizing us and ruining our lives. And now they're just like, oh, look at that Putin guy. He's the one that's really causing all your problems.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Rae. Welcome to the Caldron Pool Show. Really excited about my guest today, Jordan Schachtel. I hope I pronounced that right, but he's an independent journalist. I've been following him for a really long time. Most of the time, everything he says is something I'm completely on board with. He's very fair, very objective, very impartial. He also is a podcast host himself, but I'm going to let him get into that and what it is exactly. But I just want to welcome you and thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate you having me on.
Now, you obviously run a podcast yourself. Before we go today, I really want to hear about that. But what I want to sort of kick off the podcast with is a lot of the commentary you've been offering at the moment with World War III, like they like to label it, but between Russia and Ukraine. I felt that you have a very fair perspective, and I don't know if you found a similar trend, but for myself, a lot of people that I have respected for a long time, a lot of people I thought was sort of, like-minded to myself, I feel like have fallen into a trap of, I guess, commentating with emotion and not necessarily on objective truths. I feel like you've really captured that pretty well. And so I kind of wanted to pick your brain about things you've found, things that you've researched, things that I've seen you tweet about, and I guess a little bit more of the context of what's happening. So, I mean, what do you think's going on over there at the moment? And I know that's a very broad question, but there is background, there is context, and I'd love to sort of hear what you've found when you've sort of gone looking for those things.
Yeah, I don't know how the public is reacting to it in Australia, but in America, there's this weird thing going around where all of our politicians and a lot of Americans are under the impression that this whole thing has just started a couple of weeks ago in late February of 2022, that our corporate press is telling us that Vladimir Putin just one day decided to invade Ukraine and there was no reason why he did it. And anyone asking any further questions is an agent for Russian disinformation. So we have a very hostile media environment today that reminds me of the early days of COVID, where even asking legitimate questions about the narrative will result in them attempting to cancel you. I mean, it's so insane what we have on TV right now with our CNNs and Fox News. There's like unanimous support for this party narrative that any possible grievance Russia could have is illegitimate, and anything that Ukraine does is in their self-defense, and that there's this dichotomy being drawn that Ukraine can do no wrong. They are this beacon of liberty and freedom and democracy. When I know that's not true, because I've been a national security reporter for quite some time, and I studied these issues extensively. So they're setting up this fake dichotomy where it's Ukraine, the liberty, freedom, a bunch of there's a bunch of American founding fathers running around Ukraine, and then they have evil Putin who's invading them for no reason. So that's where people, I think, where at least half of our country is right now. They think that that is the reality. And what I've been trying to do is just to show people that there is a lot of nuance to what's going on. There are a lot of players involved. The West has long played a role in trying to purposely upset the apple cart in terms of the regional stability there. And we should be aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like, I don't know if you've noticed as well, but usually every social justice cause comes with an emoji or an icon that you put in your Twitter bio. And when the same people who have had, a black fist or, one of those water drops for climate change, and when they start adding a Ukraine flag to their bio, I feel like it's a pretty good indication that maybe there's a little bit more at play. only purely because I have nothing in common most of the time with those particular people. So that was a red flag for me, just the virtue signaling that we've been seeing online. There's people in Australia who are boycotting Russian products. We had our Coles supermarket get rid of the chicken Kiev. They've renamed our chicken Kiev. What are our grandmothers going to do, Jordan? Because that's their staple meal to feed us with. But, you know, things like this. And you've got to ask the question, like, what good does this do for anybody? Is it really having an effect or a desired effect on the people that they want to so hit? But yeah, there's a lot of red flags, but you mentioned sort of before that there is a history, there is a context, there is things at play, that it wasn't just the last sort of 2 weeks that is being sort of perpetrated by the mainstream narrative. And that's exactly what we're sort of seeing over here in Australia as well. Now, are you able to the best of your ability, give us a little bit of a background prior to this last 2 weeks and kind of what you've seen or researched or reported on that sort of has led to this particular moment?
Yeah, so it really started, of course, decades ago when Ukraine became an independent state, and the United States through NATO has been, or at least the United States government through NATO in the post-Cold War era has been aggressively expanding NATO and continually moving eastward to the point where NATO started to line up on Russia's border. And, you know, you had Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and now is the big Ukraine question, which if Ukraine were to join NATO, and they had wanted to join NATO for a long time, and there were constant discussions in the US that they were thinking about potentially being able to join NATO, this would have potentially cut off a strategic resource, which is a warm water port to the Russians. And the Russians, for quite some time, said that this issue would result in them invading the country, essentially, to get those warm water ports secured. In my view, the US and the West pushed way too hard on NATO, didn't take Russia's legitimate concerns seriously. You know, Russia, a country that was invaded during World War II. So they kind of, you know, there's people who are actively living with those memories of facing an invasion in their cities. The American perspective is very different than the Russian perspective because it's hard for us to really see from that perspective. But in my opinion, both are genuine. There's a huge kind of like disconnect between what NATO means to us and what NATO means to the Russians. The Russians view it as this force that was built to oppose them. And this Ukraine problem has been a mess for a long time. The US and Russia have been attempting to control the government in Ukraine instead of, in my view, Ukraine should have tried to be bolstering its own sovereignty. Instead of trying to make partners, they should have been neutral. In the last several years, Ukraine has tilted so far west that, in my view, the government is essentially a puppet regime of the West. Like Vladimir Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, is literally an actor, and he was, I think, selected for his acting abilities. But we have this kind of like picture that's being painted of Zelensky. He's a very carefully, there's a very carefully crafted image of what you're supposed to think when you view Zelensky. But anyway, so the Russians have invaded. I obviously don't condone invasions of sovereign nations, but in my view, this was kind of one of those things where you're chucking stones at a hibernating bear for 8 years, and then eventually it comes out, and then we're all pointing fingers at Russia. There's a lot of bad actors on both sides, and the issue is not nearly as simple as they want us to think it is.
Yeah, and that's sort of where I'm at, where I'm not on any side other than we need to just be objective about the truths that we're talking about, because all of these sort of, I guess, misinformation, propaganda, and lies that's coming from both sides is actually affecting the truth, and it's affecting what we're doing in the West. It's affecting how we operate over here. And, you know, I think at this particular point in time, it benefits no one to take a side other than the side of the truth and the side of humanity. And I think you'd have to be mentally unstable to want any innocent lives from any particular side to be lost in the crossfire of what seems to be two bads. And I remember you tweeted, and a couple of other people tweeted a while ago about how it's okay to be honest about things without, you know, you almost have to put like a clause or something, an admonition into every tweet. This doesn't mean I'm pro-Russia. This doesn't mean I'm pro-Putin. And it's incredibly frustrating because, you know, like the lines between truth and fiction are being blurred. And you mentioned the leader of Ukraine and how he's an actor. And I've actually seen you through the weeks debunk a lot of things that have been coming out in his favor. For example, photographs of him on the front line, which ended up being from the movie that he acted in. I think it was in 2018. But that's being used by so many people to kind of push the rhetoric, to push the narrative, and to make us believe something instead of what the truth is. And I'm not sure. Maybe he is on the front line. Maybe he's not. But, you know, we can't lower ourselves to standards that we've been fighting against for so long by falling into the trap of misinformation. And so there are a few things that you've debunked, you know, from sort of the beginning, like Snake Island, that with the 13 soldiers that refused to comply, and then the whole island was bombed or something like that. And there's been a number of things, but can you think of, just sort of off the top of your head, some of the main things that you've sort of debunked that the mainstream narrative has sort of put out in favor of, you know, what they're trying to push?
Yeah, because big tech has decided to side with the Ukrainians wholeheartedly, when they decided that you're allowed to now call for violence against Russians. That was, I think, a pretty clear indicator to the Ukraine side that they could just lie without recourse. And sadly, I think both sides are using the same like KGB style disinformation playbook, where there's just very little truth to be found in the war fighting. There was, of course, the Snake Island 13, which really bolstered the Ukrainian propaganda when we later found out that they all surrendered. And there was even like, you know, T-shirts and banners flying around the world about this. They reportedly said, you know, F you to the Russian ship, and then they died as martyrs. And then we later found out that they all just surrendered. So it's just, yeah. That's one thing. And then they were fighting outside of a parking lot, outside of a nuclear plant. And Zelensky did this like TV address and claimed that the Russians were bombing the nuclear plant itself. And that's why he needed a no-fly zone. It seems that Zelensky and the entire Ukrainian parliament, the Ukrainian foreign affairs officials, they are all just peddling false narratives. And you know, the same could be said with the Russians, but what Ukraine is doing is that they've decided that their strategy for several weeks now has been, we need to get the West involved in this because we want support. And the Ukrainian government right now is so in the tank for the West that for them, it seems like they have most to lose here. So the last thing that they wanted early on, at least, was to actually negotiate with the Russians over, you know, neutrality or allowing for them to officially, you know, legally annex some territories that they've already held for 8 years. But it just seems to me that everyone's lying. Like, the war propaganda is so bad. The other day, tragically, an American journalist was killed, and I wrote about this at my publication, The Dossier, on Substack. And the Ukrainian side, it was this reporter was at a Ukrainian checkpoint, and what actually happened was that he was fired on by this like militia that was guarding the checkpoint. Then they were clearly Ukrainians because it was well within the lines of the Ukraine's defense, and they blamed the Russians for it. And it was only the word of these Ukrainian soldiers that they had backing them, and the media just like reported it as if it was a fact. And you even had the guy's colleague who was in a Ukrainian hospital who basically confirmed that it was, a Ukrainian checkpoint that fired upon them. It just seems that we're so detached from the truth because for whatever reason, whenever these, like you saw it with COVID, when these reporters start to get like emotionally involved in an issue, for whatever reason, they just can't separate themselves from the story. And then they suddenly become activists. I saw a quote, actually an Australian reporter said that a Ukrainian soldier told her that Russians are hiding in the bushes all over and they're killing civilians. So the civilians that die on the Ukraine side are actually being killed by Russians. The quote, she literally said, they're hiding in the bushes. And then she just like reports it as fact. I think it was in Daily Mail, Australia. It's just like ridiculous things like that they don't even bother to think about it. They're just like, oh, I'm on Ukraine's side, so whatever they say must be true.
As soon as you said an Australian reporter, I felt the inner cringe, because I thought our political activists and journalists are sort of one in the same, and the lines have become so blurred that political activism and journalism, you can't, I feel like most journalists are political activists. That's just how they kind of avert their social justice causes. So getting an impartial and objective journalistic approach to, things that are happening, especially in Australia, I'm sure it happens in many parts around the world, it's really difficult. So when you said that, I thought, oh, where is this going to go? And it went to the bushes. So it didn't disappoint. It went exactly where I thought it would go. But you mentioned something about 8 years ago. And you sort of, and I'm sort of aware of some of the things around 2014 that kind of happened. Are you able to sort of elaborate on that a little bit for people who might not have an understanding?
Mm-hmm. So the U.S.'s strategy to deter the growth of Russia's military and its political power has been to mess around in Eastern Europe for 2 decades and launch what I think the Russians refer to as color revolutions, where we are really like pressing hard on the election, bringing in our own people, the US government's own people, and attempting to kind of like weaponize our propaganda to get our Western-backed candidates in office. And in 2014, the US kind of ran point on the revolution in Ukraine. Again, the Ukrainian people were the ones that showed up in the streets in 2014 and to depose the pro-Russian Ukrainian leader, Viktor Yanukovych. But the American side, through our NGOs, our non-governmental organizations, through official assistance, you had our senators, our congressmen showing up there to kind of rally support. You had a lot of American money and American influence being spent in Ukraine to support this revolution, even when it became violent, to kind of chase the pro-Russian guy out of town. And the next thing you know is that for the next 8 years, we helped create a government that is very hostile to Russia on Russia's border, specifically, in my view, just to screw with Russia. But was that really the best thing for Ukraine? I would say no. I think that the foreign policy adventurism and this like hyper aggressive influence campaigns that the US government has been running in foreign countries that are very far away. I mean, Kiev is 5,000 miles away from the United States. I don't know the metric system conversion, but these places are very far from the nearest point in the United States. And the US economy, society should not be in that type of position to be manipulating the world as we see fit. You see the people that we have in charge right now with Joe Biden and our woke military generals. These are the last people you want to rely on when stuff goes bad. So we really need to get out of the business of doing that.
Now, in your opinion, why do you think the West or America, for example, are so involved with Ukraine? Like what makes Ukraine so special? There's so many other countries in the world, but it seems to be that there's a lot of interest in that particular area. Why do you think that is?
Well, to put it quite frankly, I think Ukrainian oligarchs and leaders have signaled that they can be bought and paid for. So there's a lot of influential Americans, such as the president's son, Hunter Biden, who were willing to play those games. Our Western elites love to find places where they can launder a ton of money and influence. And this is what happens in Ukraine. Ukraine is ranked consistently. If you don't include Russia as part of Europe, Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe, according to any metric available. So our corrupt leaders, and there are many across the West, love Ukraine because they can use it as their monetary or corruption playground. They can stash assets there. They can move money around. They can buy off influential people. They can work with these oligarchs to achieve their political ends. I think that is the value to Ukraine in our ruling class. That's the reason why the president's son was sitting on the board of an energy company for a no-show job, making $1 million a year, because Ukraine is just willing to be, their leaders, sadly, for the Ukrainian people, have been willing to be a part of this insane, corrupt regime that just continues to this day.
Yeah, I've heard a lot. Obviously, I remember before this had even happened, there was lots of talk about Hunter Biden and Ukraine, and there was lots of dealings with a prosecutor and phone calls being made. There's been a lot, and that was before any of this. So I think it's fair to say, the objective truth is that it has been quite a corrupt government for some time, the Russian issue aside. But what I sort of wanted to ask your thoughts on is the handling of America and other countries around the West with these sanctions and things. Like, do you think that has has any weight to curbing the invasion, or is this just a virtue signal? What sort of long-term and short-term effects do you think these sanctions are going to have?
Well, the sanctions, I think, the issue with sanctions is that they can also be viewed as an act of war, especially with how incredibly punitive they've been against the Russian people. The sanctions just kind of sink all boats. And we've been seeing that in the enormous rise of energy prices. It's not a tool that I think is necessary to deter adversaries. And I don't think it works. The US has had an embargo on Cuba forever, and it hasn't done anything to flip the regime. In fact, the polling is showing that people are consolidating around Vladimir Putin, that they view the war effort as largely noble because there's over 10 million ethnic Russians in Ukraine, and they've kind of just like hardened into this anti-American position that they've realized that the Americans are now responsible for ruining our lives, making it impossible to get to send money through our banks that are all sanctioned. They can't use Visa, MasterCard. They can't access services that they had access to a couple of weeks ago. It's just really punitive. And Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons, and I don't like what I think is reckless escalation. I think that our side and a bunch of other sides seem to just want to escalate this war to achieve their political aims, when it's very clear to me that a ceasefire, a lasting ceasefire, and an agreement to some kind of terms, peace is in the best interests of everyone here. And the idea that we're just going to take these economic sanctions and just like cancel all Russians is just so misguided. And I think it's really evil. You're harming 150 million Russians, and then it has cascading effects to the entire world. But you're harming people because of what Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin did. I think is totally unfair and incredibly immoral.
I think there are a lot of innocent people on both sides that are being caught in the crossfire. And it is sad sort of seeing how, the people who are making all of the decisions don't seem to be the ones who are most affected by those decisions. And it's the people who kind of have no say and who just have to sit back and go along for the ride that are the ones that are really suffering at the hands of all of this sort of sanctioning and cancelling, as you so mentioned. And it's interesting that you said that because there was Facebook, I think it was, and social media basically said it's okay to target Russians now, that's not going to go against our community standards and guidelines. I'm not sure if you saw that, but the way I interpreted that was like pretty much you can threaten that you're going to do all kinds of things and that's okay. But my goodness, do not misgender someone because then you'll get booted off social media. So I don't know if that went over to America as well with the Facebook thing.
Yeah, the Russians, I've determined them to be they're the new unvaccinated, and then they've been labeled. I don't know if you saw it, but there was a tennis player, Medvedev. I think he's like one of the best players in the world, and Wimbledon, which is in England, is one of the majors, and they said he's not going to be able to play this year unless he denounces Putin. And it reminds me so much of what just happened in Australia with Djokovic, where they said that he basically has to worship the vaccine in order to be allowed in to play. So yes. I think that the Russians are very much the new unvaccinated. It's just so easy these world leaders love it because they just spent the last 2 years terrorizing us and ruining our lives. And now they're just like, oh, look at that Putin guy. He's the one that's really causing all your problems.
Yeah, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors for sure. And I'm amazed, I don't know about you, but just how quickly the narrative has changed and just how quickly it's sort of shifted. Like for the last 2 years, we've been locked in our homes. For the last 2 years, we haven't been able to visit our friends, our loved ones, all of this. And all of a sudden, after even the last like half of a decade where, when Trump was in president, we couldn't care about borders. Like, my goodness, how dare you put a border and a wall? Like what a fascist, what a dictator. But now all of a sudden we really care about nations. We really care about, borders and protecting it. And so the complete flip-flop with social issues and stuff again is a huge red flag. But I'm really I'm sad for the innocent people who unfortunately are trapped between two evil plots and things and are going to suffer as a result of it. But we in Australia had, I'm not sure if you saw it, I think it went fairly viral, but we had our Q&A TV program over here, which is on our Australian broadcasting program, which is our taxpayer money, and a person with Russian background came on and just wanted to sort of ask a question from that perspective, and the host of the show kicked him off, said, I actually can't handle this, it's really rude, and they actually kicked this young man off of our TV program. And what people don't realize is before going onto this program, you have to have your questions vetted. You actually have to show them what questions you're going to be asking, and then you get basically permission to ask it. So this question was vetted. It was given the green light and he could ask it. And to be honest, like, this kid, he didn't look like the most professional of characters. He had a mullet, and he, as I said, as trying to explain to you before, he looked a little bogan in what he looked like, and he was just asking an honest question, but he asked it really politely, really respectfully, and he did it in a way that was definitely not pro invasion of Ukraine, that wasn't pro killing of innocent Ukrainians or lives for that matter, yet we were so offended by it, and he was essentially cancelled and he couldn't even ask a question. Are you facing similar type things with the media in America?
It's just as bad in the United States. I think I saw that clip, by the way.
Yeah.
So we started, our politicians started, who I don't know who gave them this idea, but they started dumping out all the Russian vodka that they had,
Yes.
or they started to pass, like these governors started to pass, governors, which is leader of the states, they started to pass executive orders banning the sale of like Russian vodka. And then we later found out that hardly any Russian vodka is imported to the US and that like these Russian brands are actually made in like Switzerland, Germany, and the US. They just have like Russian sounding names. So for a week or so, everyone was dumping out their vodka in solidarity against the Russians. And now there's this move to kind of just like harass Russian people and cancel them. And they obviously have nothing to do with the war effort whatsoever, but it just seems that the Russians are enemy number one. And it just reminds me so much of what those of us unvaccinated folk had to deal with. Like we were just being treated as something akin to people who would be spreading the plague around and whatnot. And I really hope it doesn't lead to violence, because it just seems that like especially throughout American history, even recent history in World War II, our government became extremely paranoid, and we ended up putting Japanese Americans in camps for quite some time during the war. Yes. Because like there were like 2 spies that happened to be Japanese American, and they threw like hundreds of thousands of people in prison. So I worry that like the social paranoia, it's very unhealthy when it's becoming very tribal, and it just like, it doesn't make any sense there's also these laws that I'm seeing in the UK where they're just seizing the assets of wealthy Russians. So for me, it just seems like this is what their game plan might be for their political opposition. Eventually there's very influential people on social media actively calling for this stuff, to have us all canceled, have our wealth confiscated. And this is what they're doing to the Russians. And I'm kind of like curious about if this is the next move for us too, because especially this international left, what they, I think, hate more than anyone is their own domestic political opposition. I think they're using the Russians just kind of like as they're just making an example out of them, and their real target is their opposition.
Yeah, I actually worry about the violence as well. I think I've seen a few clips going around where there are restaurants, like Russian restaurants, that have had to board themselves up. There's been malicious damage, property damage, like targeted sort of attacks on businesses. You get boycotting, and all of these roads point to a certain end unless they're stopped. And unfortunately, I do also worry, that there could be targeted physical violent sort of attacks on people who are Russian. And again, I feel like I have to put a clause here. I'm not on the side of Russia. I'm not on the side. I'm literally on the side of humanity, of innocent lives that are stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. But where do you see all of this ending? Like, do you think that there will be a ceasefire? Do you think that there'll be negotiations? I think that someone from Ukraine actually did have a meeting with Russia, and it didn't really eventuate where we were all hoping, which would be peace. Do you think that that's going to happen again, or do you think it's going to escalate? Do you think that the West, like America and its allies, are going to get more involved as time goes on? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but where do you kind of think this is all going?
I think our regime wants to use Ukraine as a prop to fight Russia indefinitely, but I do hope that the Ukrainians and the Russians come to the table, get some kind of agreement in order. I think there's a very real possibility of that happening, though. I am optimistic that Zelensky said the other day that he's going to rule out the NATO ask, and now he just needs to stop asking for a no-fly zone to start World War III. hopefully he's slowly moving. It's very difficult to tell where exactly we're at in terms of like, is Russia winning? Is Ukraine winning? Who's taking these cities? Because all the propaganda, like in the US, if you ask anyone, they say Ukraine's just crushing these people. The ghost of Kiev is firing down.
Yes.
He's, one man Air Force. But the reality is it's kind of complicated. Both sides seem to be losing a lot of soldiers. Russia seems pretty determined to continue fighting until they attain their objectives. But I do think that there's a very real possibility that, especially the Ukrainian side, can come to their senses, acknowledge reality, start to prioritize their own people, realize what neighborhood they're in, that it might not be a good idea to antagonize their superpower neighbor, and just kind of find an agreement with real mediator parties that are not the United States, because I don't think that our Biden regime has their best interests in mind whatsoever. They just want them to be used as a pawn to mess with Russia. But there are a lot of countries that have good relations with both, and I think that they can maintain some type of peace between the two. And I think that's the ideal outcome. And it needs to happen soon, because as both sides lose more people, they need to continue to like escalate, and then that leads to more civilian losses, and then they need to justify it and continue the war effort. So sooner rather than later, hopefully.
Yeah. What do you think the no-fly zone would mean for people who kind of might just be sort of dipping their toe in the water? What does it practically mean if they implement these no-fly zones?
So the no-fly zone is like the ultimate piece of propaganda. This whole like notion that we're just going to be flying around protecting their skies. The reality of a no-fly zone is that you need to maintain air superiority over the entire country. And for the US to declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine would mean that we need to start shooting down all these Russian defense systems, these Russian aircraft, and probably having to do it because these defense systems are lined up on the Russian side, on the Belarus side of the border. So a no-fly zone, no one should mistake it for anything other than a declaration of war against Russia. And that would amount to World War III very quickly. There's no, like, this idea that these, neoliberals and neoconservatives have that, like, we're just going to waltz on in there and just fly our planes around. That's not at all how it works. It requires, if they want American planes to be safe, you have to do massive damage to Russian air defenses. And that would definitely escalate to the point where we're talking about, like, is either side going to use a nuclear weapon? And I don't ever want to get to that point in our lifetimes, at least. So I think that a no-fly zone should be, and it has been seen as a non-starter and should continue to be that way, because a no-fly zone is effectively a declaration of war.
Yeah, I don't ever want to live through a nuclear war. I can't imagine the devastation and, again, the innocent lives that would get caught up in any of that. Now, America is often seen as like the beacon of freedom for, around the world. And it seems like everybody kind of looks to America. Like, I know in Australia we do as well. So kind of, if America has a cold, Australia has a cough, like that type of thing. You guys are our big brother. So a lot of us are hoping and praying that the American government do the right thing, because that kind of leaves us over here. Well, does that mean we're going to be getting involved in this further if it escalates? And unfortunately, we're a little island in the middle of nowhere. And while we have a really good military over here, if our forces and our resources are going to be elsewhere, does that leave us open for another sort of lurking in the background threat? And there's a lot of things that this particular issue will affect, and it has a ripple effect. And I think that, like you mentioned, peace at this particular point in time is the best outcome for absolutely everybody across the world, not just Ukraine and Russia. So that's what we hope and that's what we pray for. But I wanted to talk about America. I feel like it's been a rough 2 years since the election results, or however you want to view that, sort of came out, and a lot of people are sort of saying that that this war came at a pretty convenient time for Biden, because maybe it distracts from a lot of the other things that he's been doing or been incapable of doing for the last sort of couple of years. But you still have 2 years left, am I right, with Biden as president? And yeah, I kind of wanted to gauge from you what the state of America is like at the moment, and whether you think the last 2 years it's, anything that sort of Trump gained has been lost, or whether that's irrelevant, or whether, Biden is, the most voted popular political person that, the world has ever seen.
Yeah, he said he got 81 million votes. At least that's what the tally said at the end. Biden has become extremely unpopular in the United States very quickly. I think he has, at this point in his presidency, usually when they're a two-term American president in the modern era, it usually works out that the first term, they're pretty popular, they get reelected, people start to sour on them quickly, and then by year 7, 8, they can't wait to get rid of them. The problem with Joe Biden is that he's extremely cognitively compromised to an amazing degree. And he's turned the country into a laughingstock, because we just know that he's not capable of fulfilling his duties. But our whole media pretends otherwise. Yet still, the polling shows that Biden's approval rating is well under 40% now, which is a historic low for a first-term president. I think that, so we have an election in 2 years, November of 2024. So but we have midterm elections for our legislative branch coming up in November. So right now we have Democrats in control of everything. And it seems that there will be a split government after these elections, because Republicans, it'll be a reflection of Joe Biden's performance, and it's not going well. So chances are we will have a split government. The problem is that our government is just a total mess if it's Democrat, Republican. I think they think very similarly these days. They put on a different, a red hat or a blue hat, but they tend to, I think, in their smoky dark rooms, tend to agree on the same stuff, and they don't really represent we the people. I think that it's inevitable that Donald Trump is going to run. It seems that he's just kind of waiting to make the announcement maybe at the end of the year. But the political situation in the US is as hectic as ever. The question is will this incredibly powerful administrative state, what some people refer to as the deep state, will they what do they have? What are they thinking next? What are they going to do about Joe Biden, because he's so compromised? And it's not really clear. I don't think that Joe Biden will even survive if he gets reelected. He's just in really bad shape for his age. I don't think he's even 80 yet, but he's clearly struggling incredibly with his mental deficiencies. So they're I think they're going to try to find a replacement for him to run against Trump. The problem is that the vice president, Kamala Harris, is has even lower popularity than him, and is just a total laughingstock. She was in Europe the other last week, or it might have been earlier this week or last week, but she was confused about what country she was in. She didn't know if they were a member of NATO. She couldn't really answer the question. She was awkwardly laughing. And it was just, so the Democrats are actually going to have to find a way, go through some weird process to find a new candidate. So that's what kind of all of the Republicans are thinking is who is Trump going to run against? So I think that will be resolved in the next year or so, because Biden, I think, is just totally incapable of running again at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because I was going to ask you the question, what about the vice president, Kamala? Will they want her to sort of step up? But, you mentioned that she's just as unpopular, which I can understand, as you mentioned. Like, I'm not sure I've heard her articulate anything worth or with any substance, and she just constantly is just laughing in inappropriate moments, and she almost seems as deficient as Joe Biden with their public speaking and abilities and things. So maybe, dare I say, will it be a rerun of the 2016 election between Trump and Clinton? Like, dare I say, Jordan, that maybe will they revive that sort of rivalry? I don't know if you think that's even possible or not.
I think that, again, it's just that Hillary Clinton is very old too. And if you remember during her last campaign, she was not mentally struggling. She was like physically struggling. There was this famous clip. There's a lot of things that are wrong with her. There's this famous clip where she was in New York City and she started fainting. And
That's
they just
right.
like her security just kind of like threw her in the back of a van and drove away. Like, so I don't know if Clinton is up for the task. And she's unpopular, but not as unpopular as Kamala Harris. So people are thinking Pete Buttigieg, who's the Secretary of Transportation. He's up there, but he's also, like, the Democrats have a lot of issues with trying to find a candidate. There's everyone's begging Michelle Obama, Barack Obama's wife, to run for president, and I think she'd be a compelling candidate for the Democrats. Yeah. But it doesn't seem like she wants to do it. So I think the Democrat bench is almost non-existent, and they will be forced to figure something out. But there's like a constitutional process that if you're going to step down, the vice president has the first shot at it. So if I'm Kamala Harris, I'm like basically watching my back at this moment for what might happen to me, so they don't go do something crazy and then find the next man or woman who's up in the pecking order. Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump 2.0, I think would bring a lot of media spectacle. But these are people who would have aged 8 years since then. They both be in their 80s. I think one of the big problems in America is that we have our political leadership is all people in their 80s. Nancy Pelosi's in her 80s. And they all have like these ridiculous issues. And I don't want America to be a laughingstock anymore. I'd rather us be led by someone who at least has a couple of young kids and a family and is like semi-normal, instead of like this like ancient, decrepit, the personification of a declining empire. I want to try to reverse at least the optics of it.
It is rather fitting, isn't it? The physicality of our president, I said our president, that's how much I like you, America, but the physicality of your president and I guess the state of your country, they look like they coexist and correlate one another very well. It's very fitting. But I feel like America isn't all lost, because there seem to be states in America which seem to get it right. I mean, a lot of people say Texas is good, apart from, is it Houston maybe? There are a couple of cities which are quite blue, I guess. But for the most part, Texas is pretty good. Florida is like the oasis that everybody sort of is looking to. It seems like, there's a famous quote, if you want to judge a nation, you give them bad leaders. And you look around the world and we're certainly got a lot of bad leaders, but DeSantis in Florida, he's, like you mentioned, a young man, a family man. He seems unapologetic. He seems pretty bold and courageous with his stance on things, and that seems like a pretty safe place for a lot of people like ourselves. Would you say that Florida and Texas, are there any more I'm missing out that kind of seem not as bad?
Yeah, Florida and Texas are the big ones. I would, I'm a Florida resident. I think that I left Washington, D.C. for Florida at the beginning of COVID because it was just so crazy that no one was willing to leave their house, and we had these crazy lockdowns. We had some states really led by Ron DeSantis in Florida that opposed these measures coming down from D.C. and ignited a new, a movement that was kind of hibernating for a while in the direction of individual rights and human freedoms, and having politicians and leaders prioritizing how important they were, just the simple having the autonomy to make medical decisions for yourself. It became a bold move again. So in the U.S., due to our federalized system, the state governors have a lot of flexibility to do what they can to preserve the freedoms of their citizens. And no one was better than DeSantis. There were several states where things were decent, but DeSantis certainly led that effort. And I think he inspired many other political leaders to grow a backbone and stand up for their citizens whose rights were just absolutely trampled. So I definitely have to commend him for that. And he's just, he's widely revered in Florida. Like if you're looking, there's like these polls now that show he has like a 90% chance of winning re-election as governor. So people are thrilled with him. People are so supportive of if you ask like a business owner in Florida about Ron DeSantis, they will tell you how thankful they are for what he did to stand up for them when all these other politicians were shutting down their businesses, not caring, freaking out for virus. There's definitely this, I think, newfound freedom movement that really started in Florida, in some other states, in Texas, and it's an example for definitely a more potentially prosperous future for the American citizens. Yeah.
Would you say that people, I guess, Republican voters, people in the conservative sort of movement, the libertarian movement, people that are kind of more, I guess, pro-freedom and human rights and things like that, would you say that they're the minority or the majority in America holistically?
Yeah, I think it's just like split down the middle right now. There's a lot of convincing that has to be done by both sides. And I think they recognize that there's an opening. In 2020, it was very much just freedom went right out the window. But over the past couple of years, I think we've taken a lot of ground back. And these people actually expose themselves a lot, these tyrants, that, this is who they really are. And I think that the momentum will hopefully continue in the direction of the pro-freedom side. I think it's kind of like a balance. So we'll see.
He's hoping and praying that that's what happens, because I'm hoping it's infectious and then it, comes over here to Australia and, to some of the other sort of Western nations as well. But I wanted to ask you particularly about DeSantis. I actually know a lot of people in this freedom movement, new sort of ones, old sort of ones, who did something similar to you and moved to Florida as a result of sort of, I guess, the draconian measures that were put in place for COVID. But there are a lot of people who, again, I thought was sort of like-minded to myself and who sort of understood and sort of we thought the same things, who have just recently criticized DeSantis for that bill that he put in with the LGBT communities in school and disclosing things to parents. And they actually spoke out against DeSantis, which I found confusing, because I actually thought that bill was a great protection for our kids and the indoctrination and I guess the agenda that unfortunately is pushed in school curriculums with, school teachers basically using it. Again, like I said, the classrooms become like a hub for political activism as opposed to learning and education. So could you explain to people who might not be aware what that particular legislation was that DeSantis put in and your sort of thoughts about that piece of law?
So there was this bill, and there was this bill passed by the Florida legislature recently. And the background is that the media views our national media, not just in Florida, views Ron DeSantis as a major threat, perhaps more so than Donald Trump. They're terrified that he's going to someday be president. So they're seeking to destroy him by any means necessary. And if that means lying about the bills that he's passing or vetoing or the decisions and policies that he's enacting, executive orders, all that stuff, they are willing to completely deceive people about that because Ron DeSantis might be the new bad orange man one day. So they don't like the fact that he doesn't listen to them, that he has empowered people on our side, and they want to destroy him. So the Florida legislature passed a bill that essentially says that in elementary school, so we're talking 5-year-olds through 8-year-olds, can't be taught about sex education, and especially including, like the pronoun stuff, the trans agenda stuff. And that's basically all that's in the bill, is that in my view, it is a bill to protect kids from like very weird public school teachers. And there are many who want to like impose this crazy woke pronouns, leftist, insane agenda on them. And it doesn't rule out, like in high school or in middle school, that these crazy teachers will try to do like the trans agenda stuff. It's simply for very young children. And the media falsely labeled this the so-called "Don't Say Gay" bill. Yeah. But what they don't say is that this specifically only applies, like this is about sex ed for very young children. So they ruled that out entirely and said that it is illegal to teach very young children about this. And this is the issue that the media is getting crazy about. They will never tell you the full truth about that because they're using it as a weapon to say, oh, Ron DeSantis hates gay people. Like, no, he doesn't. He has no issue with anyone in that regard. So it's just all political gamesmanship, and all of the Florida woke media, like the Miami Herald and some other big ones, are of course just on this train, just lying without any type of recourse. And yeah, that's kind of the state of our press, is that they will do anything and say anything to take out their opponents. They're just an extension of the regime at this point.
Yeah, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. I swear that's the motto that they run their media by, unfortunately. But I think that the media, if you look at every single major issue, social justice issue, anything that is going on, unfortunately, we're in a generation where you just don't know if you can believe what you're reading or seeing. Even videos are being manipulated. Like going back just briefly to Russia and Ukraine, there was a video that a Ukraine press put out. Imagine if this happened to different parts around Europe, and it was, videos of bombs going off on the Eiffel Tower and places in London, and it looked really real. And so, yes, it was to make a political point, but you've got to ask then the question, how far would they go to win the political point or to win it? And I think the last 2 years have been a good wake-up call to all of us that you can't trust the mainstream media narrative, and you have to go into alternative medias. You have to go into alternative sources, go direct to sources themselves, and by all means guard yourself really carefully, because they're good at what they do. There's no doubt about it. They fool a lot of people. But that sort of leads me, into yourself. Before we sort of finish, I did want to get into the work that you do. I've always highly respected your journalism. You've got an incredible reputation for being accurate in things. And I'd love for people to kind of know where they can follow you. And maybe if you're working on something in particular at the moment, you can sort of share with us. That would be great as well.
Yeah, my best written work is at dossier.substack.com. And there'll be some stuff coming out about all these topics for sure. If your readers and viewers and listeners want to go there, dossier.substack.com. Yeah, so much appreciate the shout out, and had a great time talking to you.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. And yeah, hopefully, things settle down and, the world opens up, and I'd love to come and experience Florida one day and see what freedom actually feels like. But until then, stay safe, stay warm, and all the best.